It all began with a modest plot of land I inherited from my grandfather. A peaceful stretch of wooded property just on the edge of a high-end neighborhood called Lake Point Estates, tucked away behind a grove of tall oaks and bordered by a babbling creek that divided my family's old territory from the newly developed luxury lots. To me, it was always a sacred space, the last remaining piece of our family's legacy, untouched by the HOA's insatiable appetite for expansion. And I never had any plans to sell, regardless of the many mailers and phone calls that tried to convince me otherwise, until one day I drove up to check on the place and saw something that made my stomach churn. A construction crew pouring concrete, heavy machinery slicing into the earth like it belonged to them, and in the center of it all, a sign reading Future Home of the Lake Point HOA President Est. Value $4,200,000, which stopped me cold. I parked my truck, heart pounding, and marched over to confront the foreman, a guy in a neon vest who barely glanced up from his clipboard as he waved me away, saying he didn't have time for complaints and that Mrs. Langford had all the proper permits. That name, Langford, echoed in my brain like a warning bell because Joyce Langford was infamous in these parts. A real estate tyrant wrapped in designer suits, the kind of person who never heard the word no. And I knew immediately that if she thought she could steal this land from me, she had another thing coming. I rushed to the county assessor's office the next morning, only to be told by a board clerk that the plot had been reclassified as part of Parcel B-117, a designation I didn't recognize, and after several hours of digging through dusty public records, I found something terrifying. Someone had submitted forged documents claiming I had sold the land back in 2008, complete with a fake signature that looked nothing like mine and a notarization stamp from an office that didn't even exist anymore. I was furious, shaking with disbelief, and when I demanded a full investigation, I was told it could take months and that in the meantime the project would proceed unless I had a court injunction, which of course meant lawyers, and lawyers meant money, something Joyce Langford had in endless supply, and I most definitely did not. But what she didn't realize was that she hadn't just picked a random landowner to mess with. My grandfather had been a civil engineer and had drilled into me the importance of documentation, backup plans, and always keeping a paper trail. So while she was busy sipping champagne on her faux French balcony in Phase 1 of Lake Point, I was quietly gathering every old deed, surveyor map, utility record, and topographic chart I could find in my late grandfather's archive in the attic, knowing that somewhere in those boxes lay the smoking gun that could undo everything she'd built. Over the next few weeks, I watched in horror as the mansion rose out of the dirt like a parasite. Columns, marble, fountains, even an infinity pool, and every time I passed by and saw the workers whistling and pouring their sweat into a home that sat on land stolen from me, I felt the fire burn hotter in my chest. And that fire was stoked further when I began hearing whispers from residents of Lake Point that Joyce had been bragging about her acquisition of the land, claiming I had begged her to buy it and sold it for a pittance out of desperation, that I was lucky to be rid of it, and that she was going to turn it into the crown jewel of the HOA. It was that lie that pushed me past the point of no return, and with the help of a local land rights attorney named Mitchell, who still believed in underdogs and justice, I filed a civil claim disputing the validity of the land transfer and alleging fraud, producing notarized letters from my grandfather Dated photographs showing the borders of our land clearly marked by century-old stone markers, and even GPS coordinates from his last survey expedition that proved beyond doubt the mansion sat squarely on my property. Joyce, of course, responded with a countersuit, claiming malicious interference with development, and things escalated quickly as her legal team buried us in motions and threats, trying to drag the case out until the house was completed. But Mitchell was smarter than they expected. He filed a motion for injunctive relief based on prima facie evidence of fraud, which the judge surprisingly granted, halting all work on the site just days before they were to install the windows. And I'll never forget the look on Joyce's face when the county sheriff handed her the order. She showed up at my door that night, all fire and fury, demanding I come to my senses and accept a settlement, offering me a six-figure sum plus relocation, as if I was the one intruding on her fantasy world. But I turned her down flat and told her if she wanted that mansion so badly, she should have built it on her own land. What followed was a months-long legal brawl that attracted local media attention, especially once it came to light that the notary on the fake deed had once worked for Joyce's development firm and had mysteriously moved abroad right after. The transaction was filed suspicious enough for the county DA to open a criminal investigation into potential fraud, which led to Joyce suddenly going silent and shifting into damage control mode, trying to settle things quietly. But by then, I'd tasted blood, and I wasn't going to let her off that easy. Meanwhile, the HOA board, once so loyal to her, began to fracture, with residents questioning why association funds had been used to pave the private driveway, leading to a mansion that technically didn't belong to the HOA and never should have been approved in the first place. Rumors of kickbacks, insider deals, and zoning violations began to spread like wildfire, and Joyce's empire of control began to crack. In court, we introduced drone footage overlaid with property lines, expert testimony from two independent surveyors, and most damning of all, a scanned letter from my grandfather to the city zoning board back in the 90s explicitly stating his refusal to ever sell or subdivide the land, a letter that had mysteriously disappeared from the official record, but had been preserved in his home files. The judge was visibly shaken, and though she couldn't say it outright, everyone in that courtroom knew we were telling the truth and that Joyce had overplayed her hand. Eventually, the court ruled in my favor, declaring the 2008 transfer fraudulent and void, nullifying the permits issued under that premise and awarding me full rights to the structure on the land, which by then was 90% complete, a mansion I now legally owned. But this wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about justice, legacy, and standing up to those who thought money made them untouchable. And as I walked through the echoing marble halls of what was supposed to be Joyce Langford's masterpiece, I felt no joy, only a solemn sense of balance restored. Though I knew this war was far from over, because someone like Joyce didn't disappear quietly. She regrouped, retaliated, and plotted her revenge, and I could feel the storm brewing even as the dust settled on the courtroom steps, and I braced myself for what would come next.
I should have known that winning the court battle wasn't the end. It was just the calm before a nastier storm, because within 2 weeks of the judgment that officially returned my land and her almost completed mansion to me, strange things started happening. Contractors refusing to complete the remaining interior work, suppliers suddenly unavailable for deliveries, my property tax records being mysteriously flagged for audit, and then an anonymous code enforcement complaint filed against me citing unsafe structure violations and unapproved modifications to a house I never even built, which was laughable except for the fact that the county inspector showed up unannounced one morning with a clipboard and a warning in hand. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. Joyce Langford might have lost the legal claim to the land, but she was still deeply embedded in the machinery of the HOA and had influence over more bureaucratic wheels than I could count. And while she couldn't take the house back, she could certainly try to turn it into a financial black hole I couldn't afford to keep. She underestimated me again, though. I didn't come from money like she did, but I came from stubborn stock, and I wasn't about to be bullied into giving up something my family had owned for 3 generations just because the queen of cul-de-sacs threw a tantrum. So I pushed back by hiring my own team to finish the house, quietly and efficiently. All locals who'd grown up in the area and were just as tired of the HOA's high-handed ways as I was, and slowly, room by room, I brought the mansion to life, not as a monument to excess like Joyce had planned, but as a sanctuary that honored my grandfather's craftsmanship and my own refusal to be trampled. I painted the place in warm earth tones instead of the garish whites and golds she'd selected, kept the stone fireplace she tried to demolish, and added native trees back into the landscape, where her crew had bulldozed everything green into oblivion. Residents of Lake Point would drive by and stare, unsure whether to be impressed or scandalized, and more than a few started reaching out to me quietly, sharing stories of Joyce's past bullying tactics, unfair fines, retaliatory landscaping rules, and HOA dues that mysteriously increased any time someone opposed her. I began to realize she didn't just bend the rules, she was the rules, and now that she'd lost her most visible trophy, she was lashing out at the entire neighborhood, scheduling emergency HOA meetings, pushing new restrictions on backyard sheds, exterior paint colors, even holiday decorations, and when one elderly couple got fined for having an unauthorized flag in their garden, just a small American flag on a stick, I decided enough was enough and attended my first HOA board meeting, knowing it would be hostile but not prepared for how far she'd go to maintain her grip. The room was packed with residents, many of whom had never even seen Joyce in person before, and when I stood up to speak, she tried to shut me down, citing non-member status, but I calmly reminded everyone that as the new legal owner of Parcel B, 117, which technically sat within Lake Point's development boundary but had never been formally annexed, I had every right to be there, and I produced a letter from the county confirming as much. What followed was chaos. Half the board tried to vote to eject me from the meeting, while the other half demanded answers about why their dues were going toward lawsuits, private parties at Joyce's mansion before it was seized, and maintenance contracts awarded to her nephew's unlicensed landscaping company. A vote of no confidence was called, and to everyone's shock, 2 board members sided with the residents and demanded an internal audit, which Joyce furiously declared invalid, before storming out, slamming the doors behind her. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. A few days later, I received a cease and desist letter from a boutique law firm claiming I was misrepresenting the character of the Lake Point HOA in public forums, which I assumed referred to the local interviews I'd done with the news about the land fraud, and they threatened defamation charges unless I issued a public apology and retracted false statements. But my lawyer Mitchell laughed when he read the letter and drafted a withering response that not only denied every allegation but included a counter notice reminding them of the fraud investigation still pending against Joyce. The letter must have rattled someone, because a week later I got a call from an anonymous tipster, sounded like a younger guy, nervous voice, who told me to check the HOA's most recent construction permit applications and compare them to the budget filings on record. And when I did, I nearly fell out of my chair. Joyce had been funneling HOA reserve funds into a bogus landscape revitalization initiative, but the money had actually been used to pay for imported stone, custom windows, and high-end fixtures for her stolen mansion, all under the guise of community improvements, and I had the receipts to prove it. This was no longer a civil dispute. It was full-blown embezzlement, and with Mitchell's help, we compiled a dossier so thorough and damning that when we turned it over to the county prosecutor, they didn't just open a file, they convened a grand jury. Word of the investigation spread fast, and the HOA members, now fully awake to how badly they'd been exploited, called for an emergency vote to dissolve the current board and appoint an independent oversight committee, and though Joyce tried to block it by claiming procedural errors, the vote passed overwhelmingly, and she was officially stripped of her presidency 2 days before Christmas. Of course, she tried to disappear, but the DA's office filed charges before she could flee: wire fraud, misappropriation of funds, falsifying public documents. And while she pleaded not guilty, the evidence was overwhelming, and the plea deal she was forced to accept required her to pay restitution to the HOA, which meant liquidating her other properties and forfeiting several luxury assets, including a Porsche registered to the HOA's maintenance fleet. Justice had finally been served, but even after her downfall, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, drained, but also resolved to make something good out of the wreckage she left behind. I converted the mansion into a community space. Half of it became my private residence, sure, but the other half I offered for local events, fundraisers, even free workshops on property rights and homeowner protections. Because if Joyce could twist the system to serve herself, then I could help people learn how to stand up to the next Joyce before they got steamrolled. The neighborhood slowly began to heal, the HOA more transparent than ever before, with elections now monitored and budgets published in full, and the once silent residents now had a voice, one they weren't afraid to use, thanks in part to what had started as a simple land dispute and ended in the total reshaping of a community. But as I walked the quiet stone pathways I'd restored with native moss and cedar, I couldn't help but notice how the shadows still lingered, because people like Joyce never truly go away. They just wait for the next opportunity, the next weakness, the next landowner who doesn't know what they're up against. And while she may have lost the mansion, the presidency, and the respect of everyone she once ruled over, something in me knew she wasn't done yet, and that when she returned, it wouldn't be with lawyers and permits, but with something far more dangerous, a grudge sharpened by humiliation and the kind of revenge money can't buy. For a while, life felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the breathless pause between thunderclaps after a violent storm. And though I'd turned the mansion into something that served the community instead of mocking it, and though the HOA had been restructured under new leadership with real elections and transparent accounting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Joyce Langford's absence was less of a retreat and more of a coiled spring waiting to snap. And that suspicion turned into certainty when I began receiving strange letters, unsigned but typed on expensive stationery, dropped into my mailbox late at night, each one taunting me with personal jabs only someone close to the original battle would know. Phrases like, "How does it feel to live in a house you didn't build?" Or, "Enjoy the throne you stole," which might have seemed petty if they hadn't been accompanied by anonymous complaints filed with the zoning board, attempts to revoke my occupancy license, and even a phony health code inspection that came out of nowhere and found the kitchen in violation for nonsense like insufficient ventilation clearance over the oven, despite having passed all inspections months ago. At first, I thought it might just be lingering resentment from HOA loyalists still bitter about Joyce's fall from grace. But then came the break-in. Someone slipped into the community wing of the mansion late one night, ransacked a storage closet, slashed canvas chairs and tablecloths, and spray-painted "thief" across the glass of the front vestibule in red paint that dripped like blood in the moonlight. The security cameras had been expertly disabled, the footage looped on a delay, and though nothing of value was taken, the message was loud and clear. Someone wanted me out, humiliated, erased, but instead of hiding or folding, I doubled down, installing new cameras, hiring a night guard, and filing a report with local police who promised to investigate, though I could see in their eyes they thought it was just a spat between rich neighbors. The reality was far more sinister, because just as the dust from that attack settled, a lawsuit arrived. This one from a shell corporation claiming they had exclusive development rights to the land the mansion now sat on, citing an obscure clause buried in an old annexation agreement Joyce had once tried to push through but had been denied years ago. And it took days for my lawyer Mitchell to untangle the mess, revealing that Joyce had used her connections to reactivate the old LLC tied to that clause, reassigning control to a straw manager who now claimed I was illegally squatting on land earmarked for a community center and that I had to vacate or pay a massive settlement. It was bold, brazen, and completely insane, but also technically clever. Just enough gray area in the county's patchwork legal system to force a temporary hearing. And I knew that was the opening Joyce needed, because if she could get a judge to recognize even a shred of legitimacy in her claims, it would muddy the waters and give her a path back into the HOA boardroom, or worse, into control of the mansion again. I didn't sleep for 3 days, poring over every page of county records, cross-referencing parcel IDs and zoning overlays, until finally I found it. Buried in the minutes of a planning meeting from 6 years ago, a proposal from Joyce to incorporate my grandfather's land into the HOA was rejected on the grounds that the plot was never officially subdivided under the county's annexation code, meaning it remained a freehold parcel, exempt from community governance, and therefore outside the scope of any rights the Shell Corporation claimed to own. We rushed the evidence into court, and after 2 grueling sessions, the judge dismissed the case with prejudice, citing Joyce's obvious manipulation of expired contracts and calling the filing an abuse of judicial resources. It was a brutal loss for her, but this time she didn't just fade away. She exploded publicly and viciously. A week later, a video leaked online, blurry, clearly taken from a hidden phone camera, showing Joyce at a dinner party in some coastal rental home, ranting about how the little land thief had stolen her empire and that she would burn the place to the ground before letting him keep it. A clip that quickly went viral and tanked whatever remained of her professional reputation, but more disturbingly, seemed to trigger something in her followers, because the harassment escalated. Car tires slashed, my mailbox smashed twice in 1 week. And then one morning, I woke up to find dead fish dumped on my front lawn, rotting in the sun with a note pinned to one. Back to the dirt you came from. It was personal now, deeply. And while the police opened a file and promised to patrol more frequently, I knew the only way to end this was not to just play defense, but to strike the final blow. Mitchell and I dug deeper into Joyce's financials, now partially public due to her court-mandated restitution payments. And we discovered that she had secretly transferred assets into offshore accounts through a charity she'd founded years ago called Homes of Honor, supposedly created to provide housing for disabled veterans. But in reality, just a shell that funneled donations into a Luxembourg bank via consulting fees and fake project bids. Armed with this information, we contacted the IRS and the state attorney's office, who had already been circling her after her fraud conviction, and within weeks, they launched a joint investigation into tax evasion and charitable fraud, freezing her remaining assets and subpoenaing her business records. It was the final unraveling. She was arrested in a quiet Florida suburb while trying to board a private charter jet to Belize and charged with felony counts that carried real prison time. And though she tried to cry foul and blame everyone, from me to her former board members, the paper trail was undeniable. She pled guilty to multiple counts in exchange for a lighter sentence, but the damage was done. Joyce Langford, once the iron-fisted ruler of Lake Point Estates, was now inmate number 541382 in the state penitentiary, her legacy reduced to court transcripts and tabloid gossip. With her out of the picture for good, peace finally returned, real peace this time. Not the uneasy quiet of a pending war, but the steady hum of a community rebuilding itself, one small act at a time. Neighbors who once barely waved began organizing potlucks. Children played on sidewalks without fear of arbitrary violations, and the mansion, now affectionately nicknamed the Reclamation House, hosted charity events, music nights, and free legal clinics where Mitchell and I helped other homeowners learn their rights, using my story as a case study in how to fight back against tyranny, even the suburban kind. And yet, even in the comfort of this new era, I never forgot the lessons Joyce inadvertently taught me. That vigilance matters, that legacy must be protected, and that the law, while slow and imperfect, can still serve justice when wielded with patience and purpose. I kept one of the spray-painted glass panels from the vandalism early on, cleaned and framed in the hallway, a reminder that what started as theft ended in redemption, not just for me, but for everyone Joyce had wronged. And as I stood on the balcony she designed but never got to enjoy, watching the sun set over the creek that once marked the edge of everything, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, not because the fight had been easy, but because I'd seen it through to the end. and reclaimed not just a mansion, but a story, a legacy, and a home worth defending with everything I had.